And welcome back to Reason and Theology. Really excited to have Dr. Kipp Davis on the show, expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's going to be talking to us about the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, it's not every day I get to actually talk to somebody who has handled and worked on the Dead
Well,
Sea Scrolls, but here we are. Welcome to the show. Such an honor
we're
to have you.
we're not actually supposed to handle them, Michael.
Right.
They
So
they
how does that work?
frown.
You put
They
on
frown
gloves
quite a
and
bit
yeah.
on you actually touching them. So I'm not going to say I haven't
Yeah.
handled the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I'm not going to yeah, we're not supposed to do that. Okay?
Because it could corrupt it, right? Even just by touching it, I suspect. Because
Oh,
they're
like
they're really
there's yeah, you've
fragile,
got
right?
you've got oils on your skin, right?
Uh,
That are extremely like I think people underappreciate, don't gain a strong enough sense or perspective of just how fragile
yeah.
these things are. Like since the discovery in 1947, they've been photographed thousands of times.
Mm.
And we actually have a very good record of photographs for the Dead Sea Scrolls. But when you compare the photographs of the fragments from, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s to some of the newer photographs that they started taking in like the 2010s, it's a bit alarming, just to see how much a lot of the material has just completely disintegrated and fallen apart in the space of 30, 40, 50 years, right? And
Wow.
the reason for that is because the mortal enemy of parchments and papyri that are already thousands of years old are light and humidity.
Oh wow.
So the best thing for them was sitting in the pitch dark, inside of these dry caves on the shores of the Dead Sea, because it's the exposure to light and the exposure to humidity changes and things like that has a really detrimental effect on the material. The IAA, who handles or who controls, I don't think they're really handling them either, but the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority, who controls all the fragments and the manuscripts, will exhibit them from time to time at the Shrine of the Book. They'll rotate authentic fragments through, but very sporadically. A lot of the ones that are on display there are very high quality replicas, and the reason for that is because they have come to learn you just can't afford to risk losing this stuff. But if you've ever been to a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit, you will notice right away that it's dark, and the lights where the fragments are under a fairly soft light in the dark. You can make your way through showcases and display cases, but the lights will turn off and on periodically, just because the light is that damaging to the
Wow.
material.
And this is even after they weren't they mishandling them
Oh
initially,
my
putting
goodness.
tape on them and just leaving them out and exposed and
Yeah,
all sorts
yeah,
of wild things.
yeah. So it was like it was a uh so I should probably ask ahead of time. Are there certain words that I am not allowed to say on your podcast?
That's fine.
Okay. So I mean, in the early days, it was a bit of a shit show, in terms of conservation. But I think this is in part because the Dead Sea Scrolls were sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Almost a testing ground, even,
Mm.
of conservation theories and ideas and techniques. So people tried stuff. Some of it was not good. Scholars and a lot of the early handlers of the Dead Sea Scrolls just didn't know what they were doing. So yeah, they would put they would, when they were piecing individual fragments together to try and reconstruct texts, or when they were setting them on plates, they used Scotch tape a lot of the time on the backings of them, which was extremely damaging.
Mm.
There's a couple of fragments that still, and I don't know what this is, but there is. I'm thinking in particular, there's some fragments from a manuscript called 4Q491, which is an early copy of material that looks like it came from a manuscript like the War Scroll, that has on the backside like stamps from an institution or something, like
Mm.
somebody just, and I don't know what that is. Nobody seems to know, whom I've talked to about what that is. They put fragments on these plates, and press them between panes of glass, which is, I won't say it's fine, just because it causes pressure and starts to compress the material, which causes it to break apart. Um, but it's not the worst thing. What is the worst thing is when you start taking these plates and when you're storing them and stacking them one atop the other. These
Hmm.
ones on the bottom are enduring, at this point, dozens of kilograms of weight, which is really compressing and crushing the manuscript fragments that are sitting on the bottom. So this is one of the things that was discovered, to the horror of members of the Israel Antiquities Authority, when in 1967 they entered the Palestinian Archaeological Museum for the first time, to look at the material that was left there, stacks and stacks of these glass plates, one atop of the other, and some of them were so heavy that the glass on the bottom plates were actually broken and breaking, just from the weight. So, yeah, conservation. It's it's important, and we have done a crappy job of it for a
Oh.
long time. So, and this is one of the reasons. I'll just say this
Mhm.
quickly, and we can get into some of the
Yeah.
questions. But um, it, one of the reasons why the photographs that we have are so important, and why I think the photographs they've been taking now over the in this new project for the last 10 or 15 years at the Leon Levy Digital Library. One of the reasons these are so important is just because, eventually, this stuff is either going to get too fragile for us to actually investigate and work with, physically, or it is all just going to deteriorate and we're going to lose it.
Mm.
So the photographs are really important.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And but those are, you know, sounds like going to be preserved pretty well. Assuming we'll always remain a technological society, right?
That's fair, right? We are at the mercy of our digitization.
Yeah.
So fingers crossed.
Did you, by the way, say that? So the Palestinian authorities had the Dead Sea Scrolls prior to the IA?
Do you want to get into some of the history
If you don't
now?
mind, if you could
Yeah,
briefly go over, that would help a lot.
for sure. And this is really, I mean, from my perspective, I've written a little bit about this. This is one of my little hobby horses, as a scholar, is the modern history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, their discovery, their publication, the scholarship, the politics,
Hmm.
which is a big component of this. So
Yeah.
the first cave one, was discovered sometime around 1947 by Ta'amir Bedouin. And we were not entirely sure how long it took from the point that they found the first 7 manuscripts there, until they actually managed to sell them to the first two um, brokers, owners of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that was Iskander Khalil Shahin, otherwise known as Kando. He was a cobbler and a small time antiquities dealer in Bethlehem at the time. He purchased 4 of these manuscripts on behalf of a Syrian Orthodox metropolitan at St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem by the name of Athanasius Samuel.
Mm.
The remaining three manuscripts were purchased by Eliezer Sukenik, who was the professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University, on behalf of the Hebrew University. So right from the get go, there was like this separation of material. So from 1947 until 1956, more caves were discovered. More manuscripts were discovered, mostly by Bedouin uh, tribespeople who were scouring the cliffs at this point and just looking for material, and they would bring them into the archaeologists who were stationed originally at the École Biblique, which is the French Dominican School of Archaeology in East Jerusalem. But the collection itself was moved in fairly short order in that time to the Palestinian Archaeological Museum. At this time, this all happened right around the time that the Palestinian mandate, the British mandate for Palestine, ended in the area. The state of Israel declared independence, and they had also brokered an agreement over this time to separate the Israeli territory from Palestinian territory. So in the early going, the Palestinian Archaeological Museum, also known as the Rockefeller Museum, was located in Palestine, in the West Bank, in
Oh,
East Jerusalem, right? And from 1947 up until 1967, that first 20 years, it was the Palestinian Archaeological Authority that was handling and looking after the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is where the scholars went to work on the materials, and it was in the 6 Day War in the spring and summer of 1967 that Israel managed to annex all of this additional territory in the West Bank and transferred and the ownership of all the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments that were still there at the Palestinian Archaeological Museum, and they nationalized all the material,
wow.
effectively making it Israeli national property.
Wow.
Uh,
I
it's
bet that was
controversial.
incredibly controversial,
It
right?
is, and
Wow.
so and there's another piece to this as well. They didn't get everything. There
Mhm.
are still a handful, like a few dozen fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls material that still belong to the Palestinian, or sorry, to the. It was at the time when the uh sorry, let me back up a little bit. At the time when the Rockefeller Museum was in the West Bank, this area was controlled by the state of Jordan. So there are still a handful of fragments that do belong to the state of Jordan. Most of those are from Cave One, which
Mm.
is the first cave that was discovered in 1947. I was working on a publication project for a number of years that got stalled for this reason. We were doing a re-edition of the fragments from Cave One. Uh, However, it got shelved because we couldn't get access to material to get new photographs of the Cave One fragments that are still located in Jordan, and for reasons that I can't get into,
Yeah.
the Jordanian government has kind of shut down outside access to their fragments, just because of ways in which they have been mishandled in the past. So, inquiries are always, returned and met with polite rejections from the Jordanian government. But to my knowledge, scholars haven't had the chance to even look at and see some of these fragments
So
over
they haven't
there
been factored
in
into
many
these
years.
discussions. They don't even know what's there, I guess.
Well,
So
we know what's there. We just haven't seen any of this stuff for a long time. So this is all stuff that has been published,
okay.
right back in the 1950s before the 6 Day War, when Israel annexed a lot of this stuff. So, but the photographs we have are old, and the information we have is old and incomplete too, because the scholars who were working on the material back then were observing different conventions. They had different ideas about what information was important for publication. There was in the early stages a real focus on getting the material out fairly quickly, so less so on the comprehensiveness of some of the physical descriptions or some of the transcriptions and the translations of the text, and more so on just getting it published and dealing with and handling a lot of that at a later date. So yeah, it's and hence this is one of the reasons why we're working on a re-edition of the Cave One materials. In the first place, the first volume is entirely in French, which is fine, but we live in a different kind of world now than we did in 1947, where the academic lingua franca has shifted a little bit from French and German to English. So this was going to be an English publication for the first time of all the Cave One materials, with updated photographs and discussions of their physical properties and the texts, with lots of new notes and transcriptions and translations. But that is not happening now.
That's unfortunate. Now
Yeah.
you mentioned that you were going to be working on that. What have you worked on so far with the Dead Sea Scrolls?
So the work that I've done with the Dead Sea Scrolls, I spent a lot of time working on that Cave One material.
Mhm.
I've worked on a handful of manuscripts called the Jeremiah Apocryphon from Cave 4, which were featured in my PhD dissertation, which was published by Brill in 2014. I've also worked on manuscripts related to the War Scroll from Cave 4. So that's 4Q491, 4Q492, 4Q496. I think some of the fragments from the Horayot, which is a collection of hymns and songs, also from Cave 4, not the Cave 1 copy. So that's a lot of what I've done. Oh, I should also mention I've done quite a bit of work on one of my favorite manuscripts, which I'm sort of obsessed with, is 4Q70, 4Q Jeremiah A, is a manuscript copy of the book of Jeremiah, a fragmentary manuscript copy of the book of Jeremiah, which is intensely interesting because it is the oldest copy of the book of Jeremiah in
Mhm.
existence, in human existence, and it is one of the oldest biblical manuscripts in existence. It dates conservatively to the beginning of the 2nd century BCE. Potentially, it's as old as the 3rd century BCE. And one of the reasons it's intensely interesting is because it's got a lot of additional scribal material, so secondary scribal insertions and additions in this manuscript. There are ways in which I've reconstructed the text that follow potentially a different arrangement of the material that survives from the Masoretic text that potentially could align more closely to something like the Septuagint. But I think even material in there that just doesn't line up to anything. So
Mhm.
it's, as you can imagine, it's kind of a cool manuscript. It was published by Emmanuel Tove back in 2001, I think. But in the work that I've done on it, I think there's a lot more that needs to be said about it. And then finally, I should mention that I have spent a lot of time working on 1Q Isaiah A, which is perhaps the most famous of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is one of the first manuscripts that was discovered in Cape One in 1947. It is a complete, intact copy of the entire book of Isaiah from chapter 1 through chapter 66. It is also the earliest copy of Isaiah that we have in existence. It's written entirely in Hebrew. It's a tremendously well preserved manuscript. It's one of the only complete manuscripts that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Judean desert period. And it's most famously, scholars, lay people, Christian apologists especially, like to make this point, and it's a good one, that the discovery of something like 1Q Isaiah A really changed our perspective of the text of Isaiah and our appreciation for the preservation of the biblical text, because this was a copy of, a Hebrew biblical manuscript that predated any Hebrew manuscript copies of Isaiah by upwards of 1,000 years. That's a big deal. I think it is a point, however, that gets overblown a little bit. It's not like we were fishing around in a vacuum or in the dark when it comes to the biblical text. Prior to that, we had Greek translations in the Septuagint in manuscript copies that go back to the fourth century, which were useful, and there are quotations from the New Testament of the Book of Isaiah. There's material from other parabiblical literature with respect to Isaiah, and this works with respect to other biblical manuscripts. So that's about probably worked on a handful of other individual manuscripts that I can't recall offhand, but that's pretty much the extent of it.
Now, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the readings that they contained in various passages of the Old Testament, how did they fare and perhaps line up or not line up with previous or what we had before, like the Leningrad Codex? That pretty
Hmm.
much was the earliest that
Yeah.
we had for the Masoretic text tradition until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. How did they line up or not line up with that?
Uh, well, because there's so much material, and because the composition of the entire collection is comprised of all sorts of different fragments and manuscripts from a variety of different caves. I'll just provide some clarification here to more so what we're talking about when I talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. When you hear people talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can understand this in a couple of different ways. When I talk about it, usually I'm talking about Judean uh, Judean manuscripts that were excavated from the desert of Judah. So that's
Hmm.
basically anything up and down the shores of the Dead Sea, predominantly, maybe exclusively, all on the western side of the Dead Sea. So there have been a handful of find sites that meet this description. Most of the material came from a place we call Qumran, where scholars have identified 11 caves and designated caves 1 through 11 very creatively. Qumran caves 1 through 11. But there's other sites too. Sites like Nachal Hever, sites like Murabat, sites like Matzadah. These all contain Judean manuscripts which date back to the second or first century CE, or even as early as the first century BCE. There's another site called Wadi Seir, where there were a couple of manuscript fragments discovered. So there is a pretty extensive wealth of material. Not all of it is related to one another.
Mm.
So like at a site like Matzadah, this is a smaller collection of manuscripts that is fairly distinct from those manuscripts that we discovered at Mutabat, even though it's relatively close by, or further north up the Dead Sea at Qumran. Now, when most people think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're thinking about the manuscripts specifically that were discovered at Qumran, which is where the first discoveries were made and where most of the material comes from. So the manuscripts that we have that were designated from Qumran, from these 11 caves, are located within a 1.5 kilometer radius of the site of Qumran, which is ruins of what was originally a Hasmonean fortress, but was turned into some sort of residence occupied, we believe, by a group of ascetic Jewish elites known as the Essenes, who wrote and collected most, if not all, of the material that was found in these 11 caves. In total, we're talking about probably 900, maybe 1,000
Wow.
individual manuscripts. Now, they're all fragmentary,
Right.
meaning we're talking about tens of thousands of individual fragments that scholars have spent the last 70 years painstakingly trying to piece together in order to reconstruct individual manuscripts that once existed there. Some of the caves, and not all the caves are the same either. You have some of the caves, like Cave 1 or Cave 11, where scrolls were discovered inside of jars. Scholars tend to think that these were more permanent repositories. Some have suggested these might have functioned like ancient pre-rabbinic genizas or genizot. These are permanent repositories for manuscripts that have worn out their usefulness. Instead
Mm.
of tossing them away or destroying them, you put them into some sort of permanent storage. We don't know, though. We just don't know what each individual cave was specifically used for, but they all seem to have had slightly different functions from one another. Maybe the most important cave was Cave 4, Cave 4Q, which is located literally on the site of the Qumran ruins. It's about 100 meters away, and inside was found over 500 individual manuscripts. And because we have reason to believe that this was a man-made cave that was carved in. It was a natural cave in the Marl Terrace that was then shaped and cut out and further excavated by people in antiquity. And because this was a man-made cave, and because there's evidence that there were shelving units inside of this man-made cave, we have reason to think that this was probably something like a library, a place where they housed and kept these hundreds of manuscripts and would use on a regular basis. So that's sort of a profile of what we're talking about. Now, you asked a question about textual traditions, I think, didn't you?
Hmm.
And how
Yeah,
this got.
how does it line up with what we knew previously with the Leningrad Codex, the Masoretic text, and stuff like that? Yeah.
Sorry for all the exposition, by
No,
the
no,
way,
that's very
but
helpful.
it
Contextualize
so
everything.
yeah, so this and this actually factors in a little bit to how we understand this, because it is a bit different from one site to the next. So at a
Mhm.
site like Murabat or Matzadah, there's a few biblical manuscripts that we have. They tend to date closer to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, or even to the 2nd century. And these biblical manuscripts, so called, these manuscript copies of texts that we have from the Torah, look pretty close, actually, to the Masoretic text tradition that was preferred by the later rabbis and the Masoretes, who then, developed the system of Nikud, of spelling and vocalization for the text. It's our standard version of the Hebrew Bible, basically. So most of them look pretty close to this. Every manuscript from this period, and this is important to note, every manuscript from this period prior to the medieval period. Certainly, this period at the time of the Second Temple and its destruction, everyone is different.
Okay.
There's no two that are alike,
Hmm.
but lots of these from these other sites look pretty close to the Masoretic text. When you get to Qumran, which is where we have an enormous collection of these sorts of manuscripts, just to give you an idea, we have over 30 copies of text that either preserves the book of Deuteronomy or portions of the book of Deuteronomy. You have over 30 that preserve portions of the book of Psalms, maybe one or two that actually preserve an entire collection of 150 Psalms, although that's controversial. You have 22 copies of texts that preserve, of manuscripts that preserve text from the book of Isaiah. So we're talking about multiple copies of individual compositions that are preserved in our Bibles. Certainly, there are manuscript copies in this collection that look like the Masoretic text, that fairly closely approximate and align to the Masoretic text. But then we also have manuscript copies that approximate and align with the Septuagint. We have manuscript copies that look like and align to the Samaritan Pentateuch when it comes to the Torah. And then we have manuscript copies that don't really look like any of these.
Yeah.
And in addition to the manuscripts that we have for the so called biblical text, and I'm saying so called because this is really projecting backwards
Yeah.
into a period when there was no Bible, certainly not as we know it. Individual Jewish communities, which were pretty varied from one another as well, had their own favorite collections of texts that we might call scriptures, that we might consider, that they might consider authoritative. But you know, the the meanings of these things as it's applied to the text is a bit fuzzy. The boundaries around these texts is extremely fuzzy. There's no clear sense of anything that was in or out in terms of a canon. Such things, just that these are decisions that weren't made at this point. But this is where it gets really complicated. Is we have manuscripts and we have texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls that look sufficiently similar enough to texts from the Bible, texts from the Torah in particular, but also texts from the prophet, that we recognize that these are at least heavily dependent on these older texts, but are also sufficiently different enough that scholars don't call them biblical texts.
I see.
So one of the good examples of this is a collection of manuscripts called the reworked Pentateuch, or actually has just been now relabeled as, they all come from K4, so it's just been relabeled as 4Q Pentateuch. So they look a lot like the Samaritan Pentateuch that we know from the Samaritan Jewish communities, but it's also really, really different, to the point that scholars are just uncomfortable classifying this as, copies of the Samaritan Pentateuch.
Wow.
So this is a set of manuscripts that's far enough outside the boundaries that we're not calling it Bible. But is that fair? Are our categories for understanding these texts the same as the way they understood them in antiquity? I would say we have to be very careful when trying to apply these sorts of metrics to understanding or to providing the right kind of vocabulary and language to communicate what people in antiquity were doing. I mean, as far as these people were concerned, these were probably biblical manuscripts in the same way that something like 4Q Jeremiah A or 1Q Isaiah A were biblical manuscripts.
These non-aligned texts are, is it possible that maybe they're an expanded commentary on the text in question, or is it maybe considered that this is just a completely different version of the text, showing that maybe there really wasn't a consistent
So
book?
this is a very good question, and it's a complicated question, and it's a question that scholars have been, you know, debating for decades when it comes
Okay.
to these texts, to these manuscripts. There seems to be, let's think about some of this in terms of a spectrum.
Okay.
At first, with just the text of the Bible, you've got, I think, texts, the way that scholars have identified and described text, and I think some of this too, it needs to be pointed out, some of this was just pragmatic, right? When scholars first handled the Dead Sea Scrolls, they worked from what they knew to what they didn't know. So the very first texts that they were able to identify were biblical texts, because this is something that already they're familiar with. They also found copies of manuscripts for works outside the Bible that we already knew of, things like First Enoch or Jubilees, or the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, things like this, right? Book of Ben Sira. There's a couple of Hebrew copies of that, which is really cool. Um, so things like this, right? But then there's all sorts of stuff that we had never seen before that we're seeing for the first time. So the way scholars classified this material is, in the first place, they decided we have biblical manuscripts and non-biblical manuscripts. So anything that is a copy of something that exists in a canon, a later canon of scripture, like the Eastern Orthodox or the Roman Catholic or the Protestant canon of scripture, uh, we can call those biblical manuscripts. But then, you know, and it actually ended up mostly being the Protestant canon of scripture. Anything that was outside of that, so, you know, copies of, there's Aramaic copies of the Book of Tobit, there's copies of Enoch and Jubilees and Ben Sira. So any of these manuscripts that we already knew of, but doesn't belong there, we're going to call these non-biblical manuscripts. I think with the full recognition of how problematic this was, but then also included in this non-biblical manuscripts, we're going to make some new categories, and we're going to attach labels to them. Things like parabiblical, which is close. It's like a paraphrastic retelling or version of something that looks like it's biblical but is not quite biblical. We have commentaries, so called. There's a number of very fascinating manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have been identified as Pesharim. These are the probably the oldest, earliest approximations of things that we have that look like modern day commentaries, where a scribe would cite a chunk of text from the Bible, from an ancient prophet mostly, although there's commentaries on the Psalms as well. And then, after citing verbatim this chunk of text, they would then go on to provide a separate commentary on what is taking place within this chunk of text. So this is clearly an intentional interpretive uh, effort, and the ways in which they're distinguishing the source text from their interpretation probably says something about their mindset and their understanding of the text that they're citing from. But then we have other texts which seem to be uh, developing in that direction, but not quite there. So there are other texts that will incorporate what we might consider interpretive elements directly into the text itself, building this kind of paraphrase, rewriting older scriptures in a more contemporary way, but with, you know, additional and material that's just been kind of dovetailed into the text. But then also includes some of these places where chunks have been cited and then direct interpretations have been applied to them. A good example of this is in something called, it's the catalog number is 4Q 252. This is a manuscript that my doctor father, George J. Brooke, did his PhD work on. It's called the Commentary on Genesis. And it looks like an early stage when this so-called Pesher exegesis was still in development. So they seem to be moving from just inserting our own ideas directly into the text and making a new text. They're sort of on the way of moving away from that into something more like, we're going to cite scriptures more directly, and we're going to isolate these citations from our own interpretations. So it's a spectrum, right? And scholars continue to debate what scribes were doing. Were they just providing interpretive glosses to material that they understood to be authoritative, but that their audience understood to be exegetical expansions? Or were they creating something entirely new that they intended to replace older versions? We don't know the answers to these questions. They're open questions. And as I said, this is still stuff that scholars continue to hotly debate.
It seems like there's another option here too. They may have. It sounds like potentially they could have just been copying down something that a previous community had already altered or had itself, and so it seems like that's a possibility too.
Certainly, certainly. I
Yeah.
think I think
Wow.
that's right. But one of the things that observing the handling of the so-called biblical manuscripts
Hmm.
in line with a lot of the stuff that we consider to be exegetical,
Hmm.
and looking all of this stuff together, I think it provides a strong appreciation. And this has been where the scrolls have been exceptionally valuable to the field of textual criticism, as well as to our understanding of scribal practices in early Judaism, which are two things that I really specialize quite a bit in. The ways in which the scrolls have been exceptionally helpful have been in terms of refining our own models for how biblical texts, how the early transmission of scripture occurred, even in the period prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can use texts that we discover at Qumran as analogs for trying to figure out, trying to piece together what the earlier scribes were doing with their material. There's a lot of hypothetical stuff that's been written by scholars over centuries now about how the Old Testament came together, what the original prophets were saying, how this material was redacted, how it got shaped into larger collections and expansive material over time. That's all hypothetical, but we can use what's occurring in the Dead Sea Scrolls in these manuscript copies that we have, and we can actually track some of this stuff within the manuscripts that the people at Qumran had from an earlier period to later periods, and we can extrapolate from that to improve our models of what's taking place in earlier periods. Scholars have been working on that kind of stuff. I'm intensely interested in that kind of stuff. I had an interview recently with a brilliant scholar, David Carr, on my channel. He's at Union Theological Seminary in New York. He is completing a book project right now, which is taking a lot of this uh, stuff that we're learning about scribal practices from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he's using this to refine his own models
Mm.
about biblical texts in earlier periods.
Oh. Now, one thing that I've really been curious about, do the Dead Sea Scrolls give us any idea on whether or not we can trace back the readings to an text, an original text, an
Mm,
original copy, if we can even speak of that?
yeah, so that's another question that scholars continue to debate and have for a long time. Back when I was doing my PhD, when I started my PhD work, this was the first question that I had to
Right,
tackle.
right.
Was, what is, can we even meaningfully talk about an or text anymore,
Hmm.
just because of so much of the ways in which the manuscript copies from Qumran have muddied the models. So at an earlier period, the standard model for the Old Testament, at least, kind of looked like this. There were these three versions in antiquity, in the Second Temple period, that survive in the Masoretic text, the Greek translation in the Septuagint, and in the Samaritan Pentateuch for the Torah manuscript, certainly. Um, and that these three emerged at some point from a single source that scholars identified as an Ur text of the
Okay.
Hebrew Bible. Most scholars tended towards um, the Masoretic text, which is easily the most conservative of
Okay.
the three. Um, and the suggestion was that the Ur text probably looked something closest to the Masoretic text, but then, these individual communities kind of sprung out of that and had their own traditions that they collected and preserved over time. That's why we've got three of them. They've been assigned to geographical regions. The Masoretic tradition was associated with Babylon, and the Samaritan Pentateuch tradition was associated with Palestine, and the Septuagint tradition was associated with Egypt, and in particular Alexandria. So this is all, thinking about things that were taking place in the Persian and the Hellenistic period in particular, right? That there was this Ur text probably at some point in the Persian period, and then these communities spread out over the region, developed their own. So with the Dead Sea Scrolls and with the survival of so much material that aligns to all of these, and then a lot of material in between, we got a lot of manuscripts that preserve, you know, mixtures of Masoretic readings with Septuagint readings, with
Hmm.
non-aligned readings, with things that we just didn't see before. This is pushed a lot of scholars, myself included, to even just abandon the question anymore. There's just too much mud at this point to be able to meaningfully isolate and identify an Ur text. If you're going to do that, some scholars have there's a project that's attempted to do this through an eclectic text. Ronald Handel's, I think it's the Oxford Hebrew Bible Project, is what it's called. He has attempted to reconstruct a Hebrew Bible text that came before all the versions by basically picking and choosing his favorite readings. Sometimes they come from the Masoretic text. Sometimes they come from the Septuagint. Sometimes they come from a single Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript that didn't make it into the later manuscript tradition. So that's one way of doing it. It's pretty problematic just because you're essentially leaving the project up to the selection criteria of individual scholars, which of course becomes problematic with applying these modern ideas back to stuff that happened in antiquity. So I'm still just sort of throwing my hands up and going, I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know what an Ur text would have looked like if there was one. I mean, certainly there was something there at the start, but then what are we talking about? I've done most of my PhD work and my post doctoral work in the text of Jeremiah. We know the book of Jeremiah externally from two major traditions in the Septuagint and in the Masoretic text. And most scholars will date the Septuagint version of Jeremiah as the earliest one. And I would include myself in that group. The Masoretic version of Jeremiah is greatly expanded, it's substantially rearranged, and it's later. It's clearly a later development from the Septuagint version. But
And you know it's
is
later just because it's expanded?
no, not just because it's expanded, but because it's exegetical.
Okay.
It provides all sorts of glosses that change the text of the Septuagint, one of the things that you see most clearly in the Masoretic version of Jeremiah is this refocus away from. So for Jeremiah, I was just talking about this on a podcast yesterday, but Jeremiah, the figure, the prophet, just really, really hates Egypt. He's got a series of political reasons that don't have the time to get into for just really hating Egypt. Jeremiah, by way of accommodation, or because he sincerely believes this, um, or maybe it's just convenience. Part of his message is that Babylon is coming, and the smart thing to do for us in the path of the Babylonians is just to sit back and let them come. It's happening whether we like it or not, but we need to stay out of it. That's part of his message. Oh, and by the way, we really hate Egypt. That's the other part of his message. So, within this political climate, this earlier stage, the Septuagint material, you can see this within the text itself. When you get to the Masoretic material, the situation has changed. In some of the texts, it's taken a much more apologetic perspective with regards to Babylon, in particular with regards to Nebuchadnezzar. There's a couple of texts, I think I'm probably going to get this wrong. It's either Jeremiah chapter 23 or chapter 29, where the Masoretic text has inserted, the name of Nebuchadnezzar itself and identified him as the servant of Yahweh. That's exclusive to the Masoretic text. That's absent from the Septuagint. And in the way in which it's inserted and in the way it reworks the text, it's obvious that this is a later layer. In Jeremiah chapter 29, which is the letter of Jeremiah to the exiles who were sent to Babylon in 597 BCE, there's a lot of expansion in the Masoretic version, and in the direction of not just this isolated community in Babylon, but much more expansive of a larger diaspora. I would set something like this much later in closer to the Hellenistic period, where you have these Jewish communities that are over a long period of time starting to filter out into the wider Mediterranean. So this is an example of how and why scholars would set the Masoretic text at a later period than the Septuagint. But this is even even just getting to that stage and saying, okay, we have Septuagint Jeremiah, and then we have a later reworking in Masoretic Jeremiah. But then, internally speaking, within the book of Jeremiah, there is an awareness of redaction. There is a first version of Jeremiah that he himself talks about in chapter 36. There was the first scroll that he took to King Jehoiakim, and which was torn up and burned. And then Jeremiah had to sit down with his friend, the scribe Baruch, and rewrite everything that he could remember from his original version. And the text there also says that Baruch added things to it and made a second version of Jeremiah, a newly updated version. So this is internal within the text itself. And finally, I'll mention from a source critical perspective. So from the perspective of scholars who like to dig in and attempt to isolate editorial stages of composition within an individual biblical book, scholars like to talk about Jeremiah in three stages: Jeremiah A, B, and C. Jeremiah A material is the stuff that scholars like to isolate and attach to Jeremiah himself at the earliest stage. These are mostly oracles from chapter 1 through chapter 28. Is Jeremiah A. Jeremiah B material tends to be things that scholars view as a second stage. Perhaps this is part of the second scroll that Jeremiah and Baruch put together themselves, but this includes things like the confessions of Jeremiah, which are scattered between chapters 11 and 25, 26, I think, and then also the oracles to the nations. So that's Jeremiah B. And then you have a further editorial layer scholars like to talk about as Jeremiah C. And this is really, really strong, theologically clear Deuteronomic material. It's almost like Deuteronomy on steroids within the text of Jeremiah. Um, and scholars tend to look at this as, even a post Jeremiah stage of construction within the book, where later editors are reworking a lot of this earlier Jeremiah stuff and making it even more strongly Deuteronomistic than what Jeremiah held. And I certainly believe that Jeremiah was an enormous proponent of Deuteronomy. He was a huge fanboy of Josiah. He pined for the old days of Josiah and Josiah's religious and political ideas, which were not happening at the time of Jeremiah, which is also why he was so upset. So it's an extremely complicated picture. And within this extremely complicated picture, I'm going to bring us back to this question. What are we talking about when we're talking about an urtext?
Yeah.
An urtext you could attach to any one of these stages,
Yeah.
which is why I think it's kind of a meaningless term, just because maybe a better way to put it is like this: at every stage of major development in this process of redaction and textual transmission, there is a new urtext, and urtext are replacing urtexting, or texten. Sorry, it's German, it's not Hebrew. um
Right.
so at that point, then the word itself kind of loses its meaning and its usefulness. So I much prefer just to talk about uh, the text traditions that we have and theories about development that predate these.
Yeah.
Certainly, there was something there in the beginning, but the ways in which these texts were handled and transmitted over time is just way too dynamic and varied to be able to connect the dots and trace the lines as clearly as we'd like to.
Yeah, it sounds like the earlier one goes back, the more dynamic the text is, and I guess maybe that's one of the reasons why it seems like Emmanuel Tove thinks that it's pretty hard to get to an or text and
Yeah,
maybe even impossible.
yeah.
Um, you
Now,
mentioned. Oh, go
one of
ahead.
the things, I'll just say this too quickly, and one of the things that the Dead Sea Scrolls have done, they've sort of thrown a wrench into the ways we even calculate the time and the periods a lot of this stuff is taking place, right? One of the really interesting things, I mentioned the manuscript copy of Jeremiah that I'm absolutely obsessed with. A couple of these major insertions within this manuscript are what I would identify as Jeremiah C material, but stemming from a period that I would then date to the 2nd century
Hmm.
BCE. Now, this is a lot later than
Yeah.
anyone ever imagined for when this kind of redaction was taking place. But I think it raises serious questions about, our perspective of things that are taking place even within the Hasmonean period and before that. It When it comes to the text of the Hebrew Bible, I think there just needs to be some careful recalculation and reconsideration of what was happening to the text within this really critical period of history when the Hasmoneans were in the process of implementing this strong program of nationalization of their form of Judaism, which included their text, which was probably the Masoretic text. But there's these other communities, the Samaritan community in particular. Not sure if you or your audience are aware of this, but prior to the Hasmonean reforms beginning in the 2nd century, mid 2nd century BCE, there was a thriving Jewish community, which was designated Samaritan by the Hasmoneans as kind of a pejorative, that had their own temple with their own rituals and their own texts at Mount Gerizim, and the Hasmoneans went and destroyed it. So this is one of these things that has had an enormous effect on even just the way we understand the interplay of these text traditions within this highly charged political religious climate that extends all the way into, the second century, the first century BCE, and beyond.
Well, I have a couple quick follow up questions here before we
Sure.
get to some of
Sorry
the
about
others.
that.
No, no, that's okay. So you're mentioning the Samaritans here. One thing I heard from some scholars to for them to argue for the reliability of the transmission of the Old Testament or the Pentateuch is they'll say, well, look, you got the Samaritan Pentateuch and it's remarkably
Mm.
similar to the Masoretic text, and they'll say, well, look, these are independent communities, but they have a remarkably similar text, and therefore there had to be some more text that shared all this in common. So
Something, yeah,
yeah.
and I think that's probably in broad strokes true, on some level. Um, Now it, yeah, and I should probably just say that much. I think I know that some scholars have attempted to push this all the way back to like the 7th or the 8th century, as a means to separate and distinguish a Samaritan tradition from a Jewish tradition that goes all the way back to basically the destruction of the Northern Kingdom. I think that's extremely optimistic. And I don't know that we have a lot of historical currency to make that kind of leap. But I think you can probably project some of these texts back into the Persian period
Mhm.
as more or less stable. But then again, even isolating and latching on to those elements in common that are there between the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch, is not without its own problems.
And you certainly wouldn't argue that this could somehow be used to substantiate the claim that you could push back the Pentateuch back to the time of, say, Moses or something, right?
Certainly not. No, I think the Pentateuch itself. This question, sorry, this question
Yeah.
of when these texts were first collected together, the 5 books of Moses, so called, is a really interesting one.
Mhm.
I think it's a question that I'm not even sure how far back we can press this into the Persian period or to the exile. One of the reasons for that is just because of the nature of the manuscripts that we do have in our possession. Something that's pretty interesting from the Dead Sea Scrolls is that there are very, very few copies of individual scrolls that contain multiple compositions. So that's more than just one individual work. We have like two, or maybe I think it's three individual copies of manuscripts that preserve two texts from the Torah on the same manuscript. And they're super fragmentary, so there's a lot we don't know. Um, but we have, we recognize this from the fact that we've actually got preserved transitions, which are really cool, from the
Mm.
end of like the book of Exodus and then the beginning of the book of Leviticus, right? Or I think it's the end of the book of Leviticus and the beginning of the book of Numbers. So we have some evidence that, at least these books were starting to be collected together. There's a technical question that's at play here as well. The manuscripts that we have from Qumran are just not, from a scribal perspective, there's just no way that these could be complete Torahs, many of these manuscripts, because they would end up being like
Yeah,
these enormous,
yeah,
like a newspaper roll that you get at like a printing press, right?
right.
They're just they just the way the texts are structured and laid out, they just can't accommodate that much. So for that reason, it doesn't look like we have any complete Torahs
Hmm.
in the Dead Sea Scrolls, except one of the really interesting things that we do have are, I'm going to return to this set of manuscripts that we mentioned earlier, the reworked Pentateuch. These ones that look a little bit like the Samaritan Pentateuch, but are not quite the Samaritan Pentateuch. One of the really interesting things about these is these perhaps are our earliest examples of manuscripts that have complete Torahs in them.
Huh.
And they don't look anything like either the Masoretic text or the Samaritan Pentateuch. I think that raises some very interesting questions of what the Torah was when it was first put together, who did it, and what it even looked like before that, which survives for us today.
Well, speaking here of the Torah, then something you said earlier triggered a memory of Jeremiah 8:8, and I wonder if there's maybe some relevance. It says this: "How can you say we are wise, and the law of the Lord is with us? But behold, the lying pen of the scribes has made it into a lie." That's a curious thing to say.
Isn't it?
Almost sounds like he's
Isn't
talking
it?
about corruption of the Pentateuch.
Oh
Could
my
that
God.
maybe explain why there's some distinct differences and different readings here? I mean, maybe shed
Oh
some light.
my, yes. So, can I show a picture, please?
Please do. Yeah, go ahead
Because
and share your
okay,
screen.
it's gonna just give me. I need a second to pick this up because I think I have a vivid a vivid illustration of what you're talking about,
Really?
and
Okay.
and what I love here.
Yeah.
Um, I just have to find it here quickly.
Sure. No
So,
problem.
and I'm gonna come back to this manuscript copy of Jeremiah that I love, 4Q Jeremiah A, because there's a really important fragment here that preserves the very text that you're talking about. Um, and I think I don't know what to do with this, but I think it's really really interesting. So
Mhm.
I'm just going to share this.
Sure.
All right, can
There it
you
is.
see that?
Sure can.
Okay, so this is what we're looking at here is a fragment from 4Q Jeremiah A, and just to kind of walk through what people are seeing, this preserves text from two columns. And the text on the right hand side is from a column containing text from Jeremiah chapter 7 and Jeremiah chapter 8. The text on the left hand side is from Jeremiah chapter 9. And then you'll notice something really interesting where you have an
Aside from the tape
enormous.
there, is that tape?
That's tape on the top, yes. Yes. But that tape is not attached to the fragment itself. That's
Okay.
that's attached to the backing. You can see the backing
Okay.
behind it. So this is not the Scotch tape that was
Uh-huh.
applied by
Okay.
by the Scotch. Um but what you'll see there in the middle between the two columns is text that runs down the
Yeah.
vertical
Yeah.
in a smaller, so it's written smaller. So this is a large scribal insertion
Yeah.
that has been added probably 100 years after this manuscript was originally written.
Mhm.
Now, I don't know if this is by happenstance. I don't know if the scribe here was communicating some sort of meta text in doing this, but you'll notice in the fourth vertical line running down the column, he's writing Hashemayim Asher. Uh, I can't even read that because is that a bit? Yeah, it's too hard for me to read that one. As he's writing his text, he ends up running into text from the column you see there where he has to kind of jump over it
Mhm.
and move on down and continue beyond that. Isn't it interesting that the text he has to skip over and add and continue his insertion on the other side of is from Jeremiah 8 chapter 8.
Is that right?
The lying
Wow.
pen of scribes that lies. That's the verse. Isn't
That's the
that
first.
wild?
That
Isn't that
is, and
wild?
I wonder if the intention of part of the scribe here was to add what he thought belonged to the original text, and perhaps he's attempting to correct the previous scribe. So maybe he felt like the previous scribe didn't have a complete version, and so he has to add it. And
Who knows, right? I mean, I think it was whether this was he's like, well, this is just a parenthetical comment. I tend to think, based on the nature of what he was saying, that entire section that he added from Jeremiah 7:28 to 8:4 is like this very harsh Deuteronomistic oracle about not worshiping the Baalim and destroying all the cult sites and exposing all the graves of the kings and the prophets. Like it's a very serious oracle. I just don't think that's the sort of thing you add in there as a parenthetical comment. I think if you're including something like that, you're serious about this very serious oracle. So yeah, we can continue to debate what the scribe is doing, but to your question about Jeremiah 8:8, I think that there, within just the redaction and uh, the transmission history of Jeremiah, there is a very interesting question here with regards to Jeremiah's understanding of the transmission of divine oracles. Did he actually write any of this stuff down? Did he understand his own words as a prophet of Yahweh to be contingent on what he uttered versus what was spoken, versus what was written and recited? These are all very interesting questions. One of the expressions that Jeremiah uses on a regular basis, one of the expressions that a lot of biblical prophets will use, is that Yahweh put the word in their mouth,
hmm,
um, and then they recited it in the ear and the hearing of whoever was listening. This is the way it's described when Jeremiah reads when the scroll is presented to King Jehoiakim. It says, that the scroll was read in his presence. So it's not like he took it and looked at it. Somebody is reciting it to him, and again, in his hearing, in his ears. So I think there are important questions to ask about how people in antiquity understood this exchange between the spoken word and the written word. Uh, at the same time, there's evidence from within the biblical text itself that some people understood that writing contained numinous properties, almost
hmm,
like magic. Like when you commit things within a broader context, right? Within an ancient Near Eastern context, in Mesopotamia in particular, and also in Egypt, writing things down writing is almost viewed like divine, like divine encoding. It's a gift from the gods. It's this special thing that you can only learn in the temples.
right.
It's very exclusive. Common people look at it and don't understand it. It's mysterious, right? It's cryptic. Um, how much of that transfers into certainly the early stages of composition for a lot of these texts, these texts that we now have in our Bible? I think this again is an intriguing question that we just don't have an answer for.
I have so many questions, but I want to be respectful to your time, so let me reduce it to just a
We
few
we can
here.
we can go a little bit past
Oh, okay.
the 90-minute mark too. I'm
Okay.
fine with that. This is fun. So
Okay. Yeah. Good. Um, I appreciate that. So sometimes I've heard people say, "Well, look, these variants don't impact doctrine."
mm,
Would you agree with that, or do you think that there are some instances that, in fact, would impact theology of doctrine?
That's a hard question to answer. Um, I would have to say, I think it's entirely dependent on the doctrine you're talking about,
Okay, that's fair.
right? And I think, so I think on one side, there are probably some isolated doctrines that are affected by individual manuscripts and by our general understanding of the transmission of so-called biblical texts and the shape of the biblical text. Modern Protestant doctrines, certainly more fundamentalist, conservative, evangelical understandings of inspiration and inerrancy, I think, are directly affected by this, just because it has major implications on what we understand to be scripture
Hmm.
in the first place. So I would say that's a doctrine that is directly affected by these sorts of things. But then there's other things too. Um, like I think one of the critical variants from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is one that again we already kind of knew about, but then now have actual hard tangible manuscript evidence for, is perhaps the variant text in Deuteronomy chapter 32 verses 8 to 9, where we had always suspected, we always had this suspicion that the writer of this very, very ancient poem always had in mind uh, uh, a polytheistic view of the world in which Yahweh fit, but which also included other divine beings, and perhaps even in a situation in which Yahweh receives his own inheritance from the high god El. This is not it's not directly stated by the writer of the poem in Deuteronomy 32. This is the Song of Moses, but it's certainly strongly alluded to. It's then reflected in other texts like Psalm 82. It's preserved. We have a textual variant for this in the Masoretic text, which has changed the text altogether, which has then also prompted scholars to say, Jewish scribes were so uncomfortable with this that they just had to scrub the text in order to eliminate the possibility of this, and kind of made a mess of it in the process. But we had a translation in the Septuagint which reflected on this, and we now have manuscript fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls which illustrate this
Yeah.
clearly,
Right.
right? So just to key your audience in on what I'm talking about, and I'll just read the
Yeah,
text
if you
here
don't
in
mind.
Deuteronomy chapter 32. Actually, this is fun. I'll just read my own translation
Hmm.
of this when I can pull it up. Oh, I have to actually open the text, don't I? There we go. So it's take me a second to pull it
Sure.
up here.
Sure.
I think it's on.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
was
it's over
was
here.
looking at that. It seems like, if I recall, there's some variance there between the Dead
Yeah,
Sea Scrolls, Septuagint, and others, because it looks like the scribe was trying to alter it to make it sound a little bit more orthodox, if I recall correctly. I think he was
yeah,
altering it to Benai Elohim or something like that. Or
correct.
yeah,
So
yeah.
here's my translation of it, and this is from the Masoretic text. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of one generation after another. Ask your father, and he will show you your ardors, your elders, and they will tell you. When Elyon apportioned the nations an inheritance, when he divided the sons of Adam, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. So Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. So that's the way the Masoretic text has handled this collection of verses. This is Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 to 9. The way the Dead Sea Scrolls fragment reads is this: when Elyon apportioned the nations and inheritance, when he divided the sons of Adam, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God, um, not the sons of Israel. So
Right.
Yahweh's portion is his people, Yahweh now being among the sons of God, Jacob his allotted heritage that he has received from Elyon, the high God. And I think this is the original, the earliest textual, the way in which the earliest form of this text probably read. And what is pictured here is the high God distributing the nations, and this is a common idea. Uh, we recognize from other texts at Ugarit. So
Hmm.
those are Canaanite texts. We also recognize it from texts in Hittite literature as well as in Akkadian literature as well. This idea that the high God just apportioned all the nations, of which there were 70, among his children, the divine sons of God. Every nation got their own piece, and this appears to be reflected in what the original author of this text is saying. Now, I'll just go
I
on
think
to
an
say that,
example would be like the Baal cycle.
yeah,
Um, that's an example where we see that of course predates the Pentateuch, and you can see this notion. So I think that's what you're referring to, right?
yes, there's also Hittite texts that do the same thing, right?
Okay.
And the common refrain is that there were 70 Baal. Sorry, El and his Asherah had 70 children.
Hmm.
The same thing was reflected in the Hittite literature, that the high god had 70 sons, and everybody got a piece. This is alluded to in Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations,
Hmm.
where it lists all the nations of the earth as they separated from Noah's three sons, and there's 70 of them. Um, Now, I think what's happening, what I think the redactor of this text is doing when he mentions the 70 sons of Israel, it's not just a sloppy way of accounting for what's happening. I think what he's doing is he's looking at places like Genesis chapter 10, where there's 70 nations, but then he's also conflating that with a text like Genesis chapter 49, where we're told that when Jacob went down to live in Egypt, there was a total of 70 people from his extended family that
Hmm.
entered Egypt with him. So I think that the corrector, the person who glossed this text with the sons of Israel as opposed to the sons of God, is trying to take out the polytheistic element, but still preserving this idea that's connected to, Genesis chapter 10, that there's 70 nations on earth. And we know this, because this is what everybody knows. The Baal cycle talks about 70 nations belonging to 70 gods, and the
Hmm.
Hittite texts talk about 70 nations belonging to 70 gods. So he's retaining the reality of it, but he's kind of tweaking the interpretation of it to say, well, not because there are 70 gods, because there were 70 descendants from Israel. That's why there were 70 nations. So,
Yeah. Now, so, but it kind of seems to boil down to, aside from scribal alteration, it seems like it
mhm.
boils down to interpretation when you just consider the text. Because I've seen some people try to interpret by saying, okay, El Yon here is Yahweh. And so whenever it speaks of a portion being assigned to Yahweh, Yahweh's just, you know, he's just reserving to himself some
There's
territory.
ways of saying that, though,
Yeah,
right? Like,
there's
that's
ways of
just from a
interpreting it either
as
way.
a as a philologist, as someone who reads the language, if that's what, and I think that's ultimately why the scribe recognized he had to make a change like that,
Mm,
because uh, you don't inherit from yourself. You don't receive nachla, which is the word there, from yourself.
Mhm.
There's other ways of saying that in Hebrew, and if that's what the original scribe wanted to say, he would have said that.
Mhm.
So I this is where I continue to come back and I continue to push back on people. Now I will say I think there's a brilliant scholar by the name of Mark S. Smith. I believe he's Catholic. I might be
Yeah.
wrong with
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
But he has written extensively about this text. He knows this material a million times better than I do. He has made, I think, a very good case to say that what the scribe is doing, the original scribe, the first writer of this text, is he's got what we have in Deuteronomy is a version of an earlier poem, and he is tweaking it in this direction. So he says that already at this stage, the scribe is trying to get away from
Mm.
the implications of this,
Mm.
which is why it's phrased in some of the ways that it is. It's why so much of it appears in the passive voice as opposed to the active voice. Also, why the scribe identified the high god just as Elyon as opposed to El Elyon, which is how he would
I
ordinarily
noticed that as well. Yeah.
right? So the scribe is already working with something that he's taking a step away from and distancing himself from. So this is Mark Smith's argument, right?
Right.
Mark Smith clearly believes, and I continue to have to remind some Christian apologists about this. Mark Smith clearly believes that this scribe is drawing from this ancient tradition already within Israel, that El Elyon distributed nations to his children, including Yahweh.
Mhm.
Clearly, that's what he's working with. That's what Mark Smith is saying. But the first, writer of this poem in Deuteronomy 32 is like, well, okay, but let's try and distract from that as much as we can.
Mhm.
Um,
Well,
so yeah.
well, well, so much could be said here, and it seems like there's other instances of this, right? And so, is this why some theorize that early on, the earliest material was relatively polytheistic, and it was only
Yes.
later that you start to get a very strict monotheistic interpretation with
Yes. Some
deuterological?
scholars, even my friend Dan McClellan, will tell you that there is no monotheism at all in the Hebrew Bible. Um, I I I don't I don't think that's as far as I am going or willing to go. I think you do have at late stages a recognition of what I would consider to be at least a very strong of a very strong henotheism, which is at least starting to latch on to ideas that we would more properly consider to be monotheistic. But I think even in our later stages of understanding the text, it's important to recognize that as much as people working with these texts uh, understood Yahweh, understood their God to be the only God, um, they're still operating in this world that they've inherited from polytheistic models. And the world in which they're operating is still one that is overrun by, let's call them, divine beings. Sure, they may call them angels now, or they may call them um, demigods, or something of that respect. Some of the language we have from the Hebrew Bible is already ranging in this sort of direction. The common term for divine beings that populated the council of Yahweh and the council of El is kedoshim, the holy ones,
Yeah.
right? These are divine beings. These are at an early stage, these are gods properly. At later stages, scribes and scholars and theologians are starting to think of these differently, as they're dropping them down right down the rungs as close as they can to get to the bottom. And this is where these strongly developed views of angelology start to emerge.
Mhm.
That you start to see in texts like First Enoch, or in the Book of Jubilees in like the third, second century, where they start to understand these divine beings not so much as offspring of the high god, but as created figures, servants, slaves, warriors, within this very developed, much more imperial sort of cosmic administration of Yahweh.
Isn't it Psalm 82 or something like that that talks about, I said that you are God's sons of the Most High or something like
Yeah.
that? You have
Yeah.
that
You wanna look at that?
if you
Because
don't mind, if you could,
that's a very important text. Um,
and
you
maybe
know
compare that with how it's interpreted in the New Testament, because it seems
yeah.
like that's cited in the New Testament as well, in the Gospels.
So here, and again, I'll just give you, my translation of this. This is my translation of Psalm 82. God, and that word in Hebrew is Elohim, stands in the council of El. And that's a different word. That is El. El, as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, is a proper name. El is the proper name of the high God we know from a wealth of Canaanite literature, and
Right.
is still understood to be a high God, the high God, in quite a number of the Hebrew Bible sources. The name Yisrael preserves this perspective, right? Of a nation committed to this high God. So God, Elohim, stands in the council of El. He pronounces judgment on Ha Elohim, on the gods. And then at this point, one of the tricky things with Hebrew is we are not, we don't have any punctuation, so we have to sort of think carefully about where we are introducing new speakers within an individual text.
Hmm.
But I think this is right here. So the god is taking a stand. He's standing up in the council of El, and then addressing all the rest of the members of the council, the other Elohim. So you've got one Elohim stepping forward from the group of Elohim, and this is where he speaks, and he says, "How long will you judge unjustly, putting on a good face for the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked." So this is the one God, the Elohim, basically calling out all the other members of the
Hmm.
divine council. They do not know, nor do they understand. I think this is another transition. That's the end of where the divine being is speaking, and here is the narrator commenting on what happens as a result. Speaking of these other gods, they do not know, nor do they understand. They wander about in the darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. And then at this point, the accuser, literally, in the council, picks up his speech again, and he continues, "I said it myself. You are gods. You are
Hmm.
Elohim, sons of Elyon,
Hmm.
all of you. But like men, you will die. You will fall like every other ruler." And that's the end of his speech. And this could either be what concludes this, either the narrator. I think it's possible that this could be understood as El's concluding judgment, where
Wow.
it says this: "Rise up, Elohim, God, judge the earth, for you will inherit all the nations."
Yeah.
So a couple things you'll notice here that are quite interesting, and the one thing you'll notice is that Yahweh is not mentioned in this text.
Right. Yeah.
But I think what you have here is a reflection of Yahweh, the one God, emerging from the council of gods, taking a stand in the divine council, and pronouncing judgment on all of them. As a result of that, you have El Elyon, the high God, basically proclaiming, or it could be the narrator proclaiming, that as a result of this, Yahweh now, and you'll notice this is even a development beyond Deuteronomy 32. Not only is Yahweh just inheriting his people, Jacob, now he's inheriting all the nations. All the rest of the gods have lost their inheritance and they're going to die like men. And Yahweh's going to emerge with everything. So that's the way that I read this text. And I'll just say one more thing, because
Sure.
people mess this up. Um, People will look at this and go, "Well, they can't be gods because he says you're all going to die." It's a mistake to think that gods in certainly in a Canaanite perspective were totally immortal. Certainly, gods could live forever, but there was no guarantee that they would.
Hmm.
Gods could die, and they did. Gods could be killed by other gods, and they were. Um, a very natural way of how this occurred was over time when gods would just lose popularity, they would fade out of prominence within a pantheon and just fade from memory. And in some cases, the worshippers, the devotees in these cults would just write them out of existence by killing them. So I think this all fits very cleanly within everything that we know about the Canaanite divine economy.
Now, in the New Testament, it seems like this is referred to there, and it seems like it's understood as these are judges, earthly judges.
Yeah,
And so some
yeah,
people try to read that into Psalm 82 and say, okay, these aren't divine beings. This is a reference
yeah,
to earthly judges or something like that. What do you
yeah.
think?
So, I mean, on the one hand, if you believe that Jesus's own interpretations of the scriptures provide the true meaning of those texts of scripture, then clearly you're also going to believe that the correct translation and interpretation of this is that the gods here who are being judged are actually judges, are
Mhm.
actually religious leaders. That's how Jesus is understanding this text. And I'm just going to say that I think it's now I won't say it's wrong. I'll say it's developed. I don't particularly like pronouncing interpretations of scriptures as right or wrong. I prefer to understand them as earliest, original, intended, and then later understood, revised, and transmitted. And there's a big difference here. Um, Now, what one of the things that we're dealing with is that from the first time that the writers penned these oracles to parchment or onto tablets, and they started to circulate amongst readers. Readers started to use them for their own purposes and to re understand, recontextualize, reinterpret them to their own ends. And something that happens over time with any text that's ancient, if it's to maintain any of its currency, then or any of its value, it's going to be shaped and recontextualized and reunderstood as people grow in their understanding of the world, or
Mhm.
as they change their ways of thinking about the world. Now, what's happening in early Judaism in the Second Temple period is that the ancient texts of Scripture are undergoing this process in a fierce way. So all the old texts, all the ancient traditions, all the the oracles of the prophets that have been collected and handed down and inherited from their forefathers, they're starting to apply these in new ways and attach new meanings to them. Throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see this. You see scribes and readers of these texts taking ancient oracles, ancient scriptures, and spinning them in new ways that are completely ripping them right out of their original context. And they don't seem to care too much about that. I think that's what's happening all throughout the New Testament. That's how you end up with something like, and this is probably going to be a soft spot for a lot of people. That's how you end up with something like an oracle in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, which has nothing to do with an actual virgin birth, being recontextualized and re-understood as a prophecy of a virgin birth. Matthew's not getting it wrong. He's just reapplying the text to his current circumstance in a way that makes the best sense. And to that end, he's not particularly concerned about what Isaiah ben Amoz meant when he
And what was
first
it that
delivered
may have meant?
what he meant originally. So what's happening is Isaiah summoned to appear uh, um, before Hezekiah's father, who is Ahaz. He's summoned to appear before the king in the middle of a political crisis. The king is being imposed upon by this coalition of northern kings in Samaria and in Damascus, um, because they are being threatened by this major invasion by the Assyrian Empire. So they're imposing upon Ahaz for help. And they're saying, look, come and join our coalition. Come and fight against the Assyrians because we're in trouble. You're our friend. You're close by. And, you know, if the Assyrians come and destroy us, they're coming for you next. So Ahaz is like, I don't know what to do. Should I join this coalition, or should I just, you know, say no? And so he summons Isaiah the prophet, and Isaiah delivers him this oracle where he basically says, look, don't join the northern kingdom and Aram or Damascus. Instead, just stay out of it. Just ignore it all. Pretend it's not happening. You're going to be fine. And here's a sign for you that shows you're going to be fine. Within 2 years, and he's probably pointing over to a woman, probably within Ahaz's harem. He probably had more than one queen, more than one wife. He's pointing to her and he's going, look, within 2 years, this woman, this Alma, who's pregnant, is going to give birth to a son. And by the time he knows what is right and wrong, so after 2 years, according to the prophet, these places in Samaria and in Edom, they're going to be smoking husks. Assyria is going to run them over. And so you dare not join up with them. Now, what we know from history is that Ahaz decided that he was not going to join the coalition, but he also didn't entirely agree with what Isaiah wanted him to do, which was to just stay out of it altogether. Instead, he decided he was going to go and appeal to Assyria for help. So he wrote to the king of Assyria and he said, I'm your servant. Look, these guys are rebelling against you, but I'm not. I want to stay out of it. And in fact, I'm going to help you. Just whatever you want me to do, tell me what you want me to do, and it's going to be fine. That pissed Isaiah off. So he continues in his oracle and he says, you know what? I've got something else for you because you've decided that you're going to ally yourself with the Assyrians. Yeah, within another 20 years, they're going to come and they're going to destroy your kingdom too. And there's going to be very little left. Now there's some other complicated stuff here with how this fits into messages that Isaiah reserved for Hezekiah, who he really likes, and who he really views as sort of the key to a hopeful future for this little southern Judean kingdom. But that's the original context of this prophecy.
That's very helpful. I wanted to briefly shift gears, if we can,
Sure.
to just talk about the situation we saw a few months back. It's old news at this point, but still, I think worth exploring with Wes Huff on Joe Rogan's
Oh yeah, sure.
podcast, where he was talking about the Great Isaiah Scroll. And I know you've worked on this before, and so his claim was that it's word for word identical to later Masoretic texts, and that was like a really big moment for Joe Rogan. As a scholar who has
Wow.
worked on that, yeah, what are your thoughts on that part?
Well, as a scholar who's actually worked on the text, as the scholar who was one of the ones who worked extensively on the pages and pages and pages of textual variants for this particular manuscript, as every scholar who's worked on 1Q Isaiah A knows, this was just a nonsensical hyperbolic claim. Wes has tried to walk this back
Right.
in more recent conversations. I don't think he's done a terrific job of it, but I'll just point this out. 1Q Isaiah A. This is the large copy, the complete copy of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls, is not word for word identical to the Masoretic text. There is no manuscript from the first century BC or the first century CE that matches Isaiah word for word. There's
Hmm.
none. Every single manuscript has at least small differences
Yeah.
to the book of Isaiah. A much better example of one that matches more closely is 1Q Isaiah B, but even it has over 180 individual textual variants when compared to the Masoretic text. But 1Q Isaiah A itself, we're talking over 2,600. And of course, this is based on how you're going to count a variance. This is where some of the subsequent discussion of this is gone. And I think it's a little bit silly. And this is where I would prefer to look at this question a little bit differently. I think counting individual words and then making a calculation based on that in terms of what percentage the scroll is the same or different. So we've got a varying, we've got this in varying degrees from anywhere from 90 to 98% the same, again depending on how you're going to decide on what constitutes a word or even what constitutes a variant. I think, look, you guys, you're missing the forest for the trees here. There are way more interesting things happening in 1Q Isaiah than this. I think, and I'm disappointed because Wes is doing his PhD work in paratextual features of New Testament manuscripts, so he already knows something about scribal practices. He already knows something about manuscript composition. He already knows something about how to understand important things within individual manuscripts like paragraph breaks, line breaks, section breaks, how to understand individual sheets within a larger scroll that's been stitched together, how to understand things like the change from one scribe to the next within an individual scroll. These are all things he should uh, understand and he should have drawn some attention to, because in my opinion this is where all the most interesting stuff is happening in 1Q Isaiah A. Did you want me to say
If you
something
can
about?
go
Yeah.
over some examples of that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So for my money, the biggest, clearest, in your face example of this appears right in the middle of 1Q Isaiah A. At the end of Isaiah chapter 33, which is the midway point of the book. There's 66 chapters in the entire book. There's a large break. At the bottom of the column, it comprises a total of 3 lines. So there's 3 empty lines at the bottom of the text to end chapter 33. It's also the end of a sheet. So a scroll is made by taking individual sheets of parchment. You rule these vertically and horizontally. You write your text on it, and then you move on to another sheet and you continue. And when you're done, you stitch them all together. So it's important, it's significant that this also is the end of a sheet, because now there's a new sheet that has the beginning of chapter 34 and then the rest of the text from Isaiah 34 through 66. But there's some really, really important textual differences, scribal differences between this second half from the first half. Some of the recent work that's been done by the project in the University of Groningen, where they've been using machine learning and AI to help us understand paleography, handwriting, scribal practices in this period. They've examined this particular scroll and have come to conclude that there is a separate scribe for the entire second half of this text than the first half of this text. And also, further work has been done, which shows that this second half of 1Q Isaiah A was copied from a completely different
Mm,
manuscript itself.
mm,
And the reason we know this is because the scribe of the second half left these large breaks in the text. I would count those as pretty significant variants, by the way. Large breaks in the text where it clearly shows that he's not sure what to do. But then a scribe at a later period of time has come along and filled in the missing text, right?
could it be that what he was copying from was broken off or something like that? Or
That's it, right?
oh, okay,
These appear in places within the manuscript which show us that the exemplar, so the exemplar is the copy that the scribe is working from, his exemplar is damaged,
okay,
probably at the bottom. So he gets to the bottom of his scroll and he can't see
all
what's
right,
there.
all right,
So he just decides, "Oh, I'm going to leave this blank. When I get a better copy, I'm going to come back
yeah,
and fill it in, or somebody else will do it for me," right?
yeah,
Now, not every time, and this is also what's really interesting. There's a couple of places where he feels confident enough that he knows the text. He's like, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to be like Batman and I'm going to
yeah.
fill it in, right? Interestingly, it's close, but it's not exactly the
It's not the
same.
same
It's
thing. Yeah,
kind of a it's a paraphrastic retelling, and I think he did a
yeah,
pretty good job. Like it's really close in a lot of these cases, but it's absolutely obvious that
yeah.
he is just remembering what the text says from, like, he doesn't have it in front of him. He's just,
And there's no way that that he's looking at some text. It
I
has.
don't think so. It's like and again, because these appear physically within the manuscript in such a way that we can analyze them on the basis, it's like clockwork, right? Oh, here's a place where he's either going to fill it in or he's just going to leave it blank, right? So no, I don't think it's another exemplar, and it begins and ends exactly, where we would expect it. So it's the kind of thing where you're going, yeah. I mean, I suppose that possibility is out there, but
Mhm, mhm.
it's the much it's completely uh what's the word, like it's such a remote possibility. I think
It's very unlikely.
it's not
Yeah.
really worth considering. So, but what
Mhm.
do we have here in total? How do we understand this? uh when looking at other manuscripts that we have from the Second Temple period, Jewish manuscripts from the Judean desert, we have a lot, right? I mentioned that we have a handful of manuscript which preserve breaks between individual compositions. Some of the best evidence we have for this is from copies we have of the Minor Prophet Scroll. Every copy that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls of the individual minor prophets, it looks like they all came from, a larger manuscript that collected all 12 prophets together. Okay. We have quite a few breaks from, the end of one prophet to the beginning of another within these individual manuscripts. And the way this is customarily done is to leave, to end your prophecy of Joel, to skip a line and to begin your text of Amos. There's a couple of places in Torah manuscripts in particular. We have like 3 I mentioned in Torah manuscripts where they want to show the change from the end of the book of Exodus to the beginning of the book of Leviticus. They leave not just 1 line, but 3 empty lines, and then start the subsequent book on the 4th line. This is what we have in the book of Isaiah. The scribe has left, and I'm going to say this because it's important. We have no evidence to the contrary to suggest that the scribe was just leaving a large section break. There is nothing in the entire collection of manuscripts that we have to suggest that the scribe didn't think that what he was dealing with when he came to the end of Isaiah chapter 33 was the end of the book of Isaiah. And then what was appended on to that was something that probably approximated what scholars will describe as 2nd and 3rd Isaiah.
But see, that's what's confusing to me, because I thought 2nd and 3rd Isaiah would break up at different times and places. So does this actually go against that thesis?
Well, I think one of the things, classically, 2nd and 3rd Isaiah, so 1st Isaiah classically ends at Isaiah chapter 39. But bear in mind that this has all been hypothetical. We've never had any manuscript evidence for this, but scholars have had intuitions, right, that say, and I'll put it like this. What you have in the book of Isaiah, when you're thinking of it in terms of these blocks of materials, let's put chapters 1 through chapter 33 in a large block together that all scholars can agree on as 1st Isaiah. But then when you get to things like chapter 34, chapter 35, they belong to 1st Isaiah, but only because chapter 36 through chapter 39 is historical narrative. Okay? It's this prosaic chunk that came out of the Deuteronomistic history. It's basically identical, right, to what's in 2nd Kings. So somebody just added this to this original 1st Isaiah text, and then everyone's agreed that chapters 40 through 55 is 2nd Isaiah, and then chapters 56 through 66 is 3rd Isaiah. We've never had any kind of manuscript evidence to bolster these theories. But something else that scholars have really struggled with is, what do you do with chapters 34 and chapters 35? Because on their own, they're not particularly like a lot of the rest of 1st Isaiah. And I would say that the way this model, the way we've inherited this model, is in the sense that scholars have looked at this and gone, well, one of the features that we see among prophets in antiquity, in other texts of and other manuscripts, is that they will often conclude their work with historical narrative. Okay? So that probably means that 1st Isaiah ended with this large historical narrative chunk, which means we have to also include chapters 34 and 35 in this, but then also recognizing that scholars have been writing for a long time about how chapters 34 and 35 show quite a bit of redactional features in terms of the ways in which they think scribes were working. First Isaiah. So when I approach this question, I tend to look at it like this and say, yeah, even though scribes I think have been right all along that there's a difference between First Isaiah and Second Isaiah and Third Isaiah, maybe we haven't quite got it right in terms of how these differences appeared in antiquity, and we need to start rethinking that. And some scholars have started doing just that. My Dr. Fodder, his dissertation supervisor was the great William S. Brownlee, who wrote quite a bit about 1Q Isaiah A. He was one of the two uh, non-Europeans, non-European people, or sorry, first non no no, I got that wrong. First Western people, uh, uh, non-Eastern people to see 1Q Isaiah A. He was the first one to make any kind of transcription of 1Q Isaiah A in the early stages, right? So he's been working with this manuscript from the very beginning. William Brownlee wrote a very important article in which he started to rethink how a scribe would think about a manuscript like 1Q Isaiah A from a compositional perspective. And he forwarded this argument that he thought that this scribe understood 1Q, the book of Isaiah as comprising two components, not three. And we can justify that by saying over time, this is not something that happens all at once, right? This is something that develops over centuries, probably. So over time, people are going to develop their own understandings of what the book of Isaiah is, and then what second, third Isaiah is. So what we're looking at here is a stage in the transmission process at which second and third Isaiah is no longer viewed as distinct, but probably the same composition. And who knows at what point that occurred, but it looks like at this point that's happened already. But there's still this dichotomy between first Isaiah and then the rest of Isaiah. And he thinks that the way this originally broke down was that the two halves of Isaiah were viewed as harmonious, parallel compositions, and then they're structured in a similar thematic sense that comprises all of chapters 1 through 33, and then the pattern repeats in chapters 34 through 66. So his work on this is really interesting, but that's how he started to propose that this is probably, maybe this is the way the scribe understood the whole composition.
Doesn't the ending of the first half, it's
Mhm.
just historical narrative, but the ending of second Isaiah looks like it's eschatological in nature. It
Yeah.
doesn't look like it's
Yep.
historical narrative. So how?
So, and
Therefore,
I would have to, I don't have Brownlee's work handy in front
yeah,
of me.
sure,
I'd have to pull it up in front of me and look at it. So,
yeah,
but he didn't break it down in terms of prose versus poetry so much as
okay,
thematic stuff
I
too,
see,
right?
I see.
So, now I'll say one other thing here, which I think is really important. And this is something that my Dr. Father George Brooke brought to the equation. The other piece of this puzzle is taking a look and seeing how the rest of the manuscripts of Isaiah at Qumran, remember we have 22.
Hmm.
So how do they fit into this picture?
Right, right.
And this is very interesting because we have 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Isaiah B, 4Q Isaiah A, and 4Q Isaiah C, I think. We have these four manuscripts which preserve the entire book of Isaiah. Of course, the only intact one of those is 1Q Isaiah A. The other three are fragmentary. A couple of them are really fragmentary. And what we're missing is some of these important transition points between, where a scribe might have understood the beginning or the end of an individual composition. So, but we only have these four manuscripts which preserved the entire text from Isaiah chapter 1 through 66. That leaves us with 17. I said there were 22. 18, sorry,
Mhm.
individual copies of Isaiah, and we're pretty clear on this, just based on the ways in which scholars have been able to reconstruct these texts, that every single one of these preserved text from either only First Isaiah, ending with chapter 33, or Second and Third Isaiah, comprising text from chapters 34 through 66. Now, I think that's intensely meaningful,
Yeah.
because what that communicates to me is that what we're observing in 1Q Isaiah A is also reflected in a sizable number of these other manuscripts. And let's to be clear here, some of these are so fragmentary that we just have no idea even if they're just manuscript copies of third Isaiah, or manuscript copies of a handful of chapters
Mhm.
from second. I maybe some of these manuscripts are just, you know, a collection of the servant songs. A lot more work needs to be done on this. We're sort of at the early stages of some of this work, which I think is intensely exciting.
Yeah, it sounds like it, and I'm looking forward to hearing the results of it. Um, I want to ask you another question here. As I understand that your research into the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls
Hmm.
led you from being a Christian to, I guess, just I don't know if you're an atheist or agnostic or what. But it
I'm
led
not
you
telling.
to, yeah, okay. It led you to leave Christianity. And could you
Yeah.
talk about why that is?
Sure. So, and it's, I don't think, I continue to maintain, and I tell people that that wasn't really it wasn't I don't want to be crass here, but that wasn't the final nail for me.
Hmm.
And so I grew up in a pretty conservative, evangelical Christian household. I started my post secondary education with intentions of going into ministry and going to seminary. But pretty early on, I was in my early 20s when I decided that I was going to change tack and move in a more academic direction. And when I did that, I left college and transferred into university. And pretty quickly, I developed what I would consider more critical scholarly ideas about the text of the Bible. My entire view of the Bible changed pretty dramatically in that early period, but I was still a Christian for most of my adult life. It wasn't until much more recently that I just I couldn't in good conscience continue to call myself a Christian. And a lot of that actually had to do, certainly my views on the Bible and my scholarship has been a contributing factor to that. I'd be naive to think it wasn't.
Hmm.
But that wasn't, I was for most of I'll tell people this, I was for most of my adult life a pretty liberal, progressive Christian, but still a Christian. Much more recently, I've stopped calling myself a Christian, and we certainly don't have time to get into a lot of this kind of stuff. But a lot of what did it for me was my own relationship with my children. I People know that all three of my children, my adult children now, are adopted, and all three of them came out of the foster system and had uh, their own challenges with attachment disorder and with mental health pieces um, that were really difficult as a young parent. And there were parts of this, I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but there were psychological, social, neurological components to this that I really, really struggled with some of my own perspectives of God, some of them my own theological models, to the point where, I mean, that's kind of what did it for me. So, but yeah, it's and I know, and this is maybe I tell this story because I do get sick and tired of people insisting that I was just a fundamentalist who's transferred my own fundamentalist ideas to the other side of the coin, which is I absolutely not something that happened. And
Mm,
most of my friends in academia are still very deeply committed Jewish people. They're very strongly committed Christians. They're Catholics. They're they're non-confessional, and all of us continue to hold a lot of the same principles in terms of our reading of the text of the Bible, the same. And I'll just say, if anybody has followed my channel for any time, and for anyone who's new to my material, I really blanch at the suggestion that I am attacking Christianity or attacking religion in any respect. In fact, a sentence that appears in the introduction of my forthcoming book is that I really like the idea of religion. I'm a scholar of religion. I mean, of course, I am fascinated by this. I am not interested in driving people away from their religion. What I'm interested in is driving people away from away from harmful ideas and steering them towards helpful ideas, and those within the text of scripture. I am intensely interested in making people fall in love with the Bible, but from the perspective of gaining a clear understanding of how this text fits into the cultural, religious, social, political world of its origins, and then the worlds of its development. To my mind, that's where the most interest is. I don't want the text to be flat. I
mm.
want it to be interesting because it is interesting.
And so it wouldn't necessarily be your research into the Dead Sea Scrolls that led, I guess, to your conclusion. That would be just something
I'm
completely
sure it,
different.
I'm sure it contributed to it, right?
Mhm.
It had to, but it certainly wasn't the only thing. I don't think it was the primary thing. It was just part of it.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. Wow. Tell me about this book that you're coming out with.
Okay. So, within days, people should be able to purchase my new book called God's Propaganda: Pulling Back the Curtain on What the Bible Wants You to See. There's, sorry, that's my dog. There's not a link yet, but there will be in a few days, and I'll make sure you have it. And I hope you can include that in the
Mm,
description.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
this is a book that it's a book about the intersection between the material culture and the history of ancient Israel, from which the text of from which the text of the Bible came, the intersection of that with the texts of the Bible as we have them. I think that probably one of the best lenses to view the biblical text, to view the text of the Old Testament, is through the understanding that most of this is propaganda supported and promoted by people in power in an effort to support their own administrations, their own ideas, their own theologies over time. Not consistently so, but certainly that's, I believe, is what is reflected in the text of the Bible. This book came out of a course that I taught for years on Israelite religion and Old Testament theology. It has expanded enormously from the course, and I explore uh, ideas in 17 individual chapters with respect to things like, you know, the two creation accounts in the book of Genesis, why they're different, what some of the differences are between them, how to understand them in their original cultural context, some of the fun things that appear in them. I have an entire chapter dedicated to the Exodus story and how that uh, became sort of the national unifying story for this people called Israel, where it came from, how it developed. I have an entire chapter dedicated to the succession narrative. This really wild text in 2 Samuel chapter 9 through 1 Kings chapter 2, the story of David and Bathsheba and his children, and how Solomon became king. What's really going on there? Is there any historical currency to this? How do
Hmm.
we read this within a broader cultural context? I have, an entire chapter dedicated to wisdom literature. Maybe my favorite chapter in the book, the last chapter of the book, is an entire chapter that I've dedicated to the question of apocalypticism and the emergence of Judaism from out of the crisis of the Babylonian captivity and destruction of Jerusalem, and the captivity and the exile. So it's a broad ranging book, generally focused on how the biblical text is a source of propaganda for some of these very old, very ancient traditions that ended up being transmitted over time and understood and recontextualized by different groups.
I'm looking forward to reading it. Whenever you release it, I'd like to take a
Oh,
look. Maybe invite you back on to talk about it.
it will be available on August the 5th. So it will be shipping on August the 15th.
Okay.
People will be able to purchase it imminently, probably,
Okay.
hopefully within the next couple of days, hopefully before the weekend.
Well,
Uh,
whenever
People
you
could
get a
actually
link to it,
pre-order.
send it to me, and
Yeah,
that way I can put it in the yeah. And if you have
absolutely.
just a few seconds for a couple of chat questions, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Um, Nicholas is asking, how can we best explore the historical context of these texts and belief systems without reading past the intent of the authors and importing our own beliefs? Or
That's very challenging, but I would say the best way to do this is to read broadly about other cognate comparative literature. Uh, Understanding the Bible and understanding early authorial intent should be informed by how the Bible fits into its world, which means how do these texts look and compare to texts that were composed in the same region and around the same time? So you're looking at this very large collection of literature that we know from Ugarit, Canaanite literature, from collections of literature in that we now have from the Hittites or from the Assyrians or from the Babylonians or the Egyptians. Uh, it's important to gain a broad understanding, and that's a lot of work. But it's there are certainly accessible resources to that end. There's a lot of really good books that scholars have written. I hope you can find some of that through reading my book, but I'm certainly not alone. My friend and colleague Dan McClellan just published a book that does a pretty good job of this. His own PhD supervisor, Professor Francesca Stavrokopoulou, published a brilliant book called God's Anatomy, which is an exploration not just of the physicality of Yahweh in the early stages of Israel's history, but it's properly an investigation of early Israelite religions, ideas, and history. So I often recommend that book. There's another book by a scholar that I really admire by the name of Jacob Wright, called Why the Bible. Is it Why the Bible? There's more to the title, but if you just type in Jacob Wright and Why the Bible, you'll find it. Um, it's an excellent book. So there's certainly resources out there. Some other books too that I would recommend to people are things like Eric Kleins's 1177 BCE, where he or 1177 BC, sorry, which is a really accessible primer on what happened at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age during this critical period of shift when the great empires collapsed and this new world kind of emerged out of that. He's followed that up with an excellent book called After 1177 BC. So that's a really good one. Yeah, so there are certainly resources out there. I'll also plug my good friend Joshua Bowen. Don't let the title scare you. the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, volumes 1 and 2. I think people of all faiths can gain a strong appreciation just from the cultural backgrounds of the Bible from Josh's book, because he structured his book so well. Each book begins with a discussion of the archaeology of a particular place in a particular time, and then moves into, what scholars are saying about this literature, and then how the text of the Bible fits into it. So there's just a sampling. Um, there's a wealth of material, but it just, yeah, read read broadly, read widely, read openly, pay attention to what critical scholars are saying. But I think in terms of just even approaching the biblical text on your own and accessing the literature, try your best to think about what the text is saying if you were approaching it for the very first time. Try and approach a text and say, what's going on here from this author's perspective, maybe even without a knowledge of anything else that's been written in this direction. So I think that can be helpful. Um, but yeah, uh, read broadly, read carefully, and don't be afraid of some of the questions that you have with
Mhm.
regards to the text too. Right? I think the questions are important. I think they're good. Ultimately, it's how we grow. It's how we learn.
Now, there's another question here from Chris. Um, Given the information from Dead Sea Scrolls, does this make the Septuagint
Oh
version of
yeah.
Jeremiah more authentic than the Masoretic text?
So I forgot to mention something about this. There are 6 copies of the Book of Jeremiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're all fragmentary, but it's quite interesting because we actually have a mixture among those 6. 2 of those manuscripts are copies of the Septuagint version of Jeremiah. There's at least one that's a copy of the Masoretic version of Jeremiah. We just don't have enough of the others to make a clear decision one way or the other. In terms of more authentic, so I'll say, just the existence, that's kind of exciting actually, because prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we only knew the Septuagint version of Jeremiah through the translation, right? The Greek translation of the text. But scholars always assumed, just through a lot of hard work, that the Septuagint translation reflected just an entirely different Hebrew tradition. And one of the really exciting things about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is we now have examples. We have manuscripts written in Hebrew, which look pretty close to what appears in the Septuagint translation. So in terms of this question of authenticity, um, yeah, for a variety of reasons that I've explained here, I tend towards this idea. I'm a firm believer that the Septuagint version is an earlier stage of development in Jeremiah compared to the Masoretic version. So I'll say right at the outset, the fact that there are copies of Septuagint Jeremiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think works. It falls into this idea. Um, I think we're working at a period of time though that's probably we're at a point in time when the versions themselves, the Septuagint version, the Masoretic version, whatever other version we have of Jeremiah, uh, they're they're all kind of just part of this wider landscape of variation where people didn't set so much importance on having the right version, if
Mm.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think
Susan,
I'll just say one more thing too. I think there's also, it's probably also, I think you could probably also suggest that maybe people in antiquity understanding, I'm sure they understood that there were different versions of individual texts. They don't seem to care, but maybe they also saw that individual versions were more useful for saying certain things than others, right? So I think part of our perspective of how people were handling manuscripts, handling texts, were that they weren't married necessarily to this version of the text, but also understood this particular version suits my purposes when responding to these more particular questions. But there's times when I actually prefer what's in that version because it suits my theology better.
This one from Susan: is Dr. Davis including the Deuterocanonicals in your new book? Is it mostly the
Oh,
Protocanonicals that you're addressing, or?
oh no, I mean most of the Deuterocanonicals tend to be pretty late, right? Most of this is literature that comes from the early Jewish period. You know, Ben Sira was written in the like the late third century, and then the Maccabees were also written. I think the earliest text that we probably have is the Book of Baruch, from the Deuterocanonicals. Maybe Tobit is pretty early too, but like a lot of this stuff is I touch on it a little bit in my last chapter when I'm dealing with some of those later texts, and I certainly I have a very inclusive view of this question of scripture, where I think this is a question that belongs to individual communities, and I don't really care. To me, it's all just very intensely interesting, sacred, ancient literature. That's it. So when I'm reading, the book of Daniel, or I'm reading the book of Baruch, I think they're separated by time. I think they come from different periods of history and from pretty different Jewish communities. But to me, the people who wrote Baruch understood that this was sacred writing. The people who collected it understood that this was sacred writing, in the same sense that the people who were writing and redacting the Daniel material were doing this too, right? So, but there's probably when you look at my index, the deuterocanonical stuff is pretty thin, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that most of my focus is on an earlier period.
Seems like the Essene community held to a pretty wide view of
Yeah,
what would constitute
very.
scripture.
I would say very inclusive. Very inclusive. I don't think they cared so much about what was in and out. We certainly have a good idea of things that they really liked, right? Like they really loved Isaiah, they really
Right,
loved Deuteronomy, Psalms,
right.
Enoch, uh, but and there were things that they just didn't particularly care for much. They don't seem to have had much use for well, they just didn't have the book of Esther, for
I was
example,
going to
right?
say Esther's not there, right?
No, they don't seem to have had much use for the book, the Kings and the Chronicles,
Hmm.
and I think that kind of makes sense given where they were at in their own thinking. They were getting ready for the end of the world, and they were trying to read what the prophecies had to say about getting ready for the end of the world. So they sort of set their focus on that. That's not to say I don't think they considered. I don't think they didn't consider some of these other things authoritative. I think just a lot of it is stuff that they were, you know, it just didn't seem as pertinent um, and urgent.
Do you
uh,
think they didn't value Esther just because the lack of the divine name in there or something? Or
I don't know. I just really don't. Um, one important thing is we do have a number of places in the Dead Sea Scrolls which talk about feasts, right? Appropriate calendars and when to celebrate certain things. So none of them cared about Purim, which is a shame because it's like the best Jewish feast. So I don't know. Let me say that as much of an appreciation as I have for the literature and as fascinated as I am by the people, the Essenes were just no fun. They were not. I think they would have been kind of miserable. So, I mean, if you can't celebrate Purim, come on.
Were
So
they more puritanical, I guess?
yeah, they're just not
Okay.
fun. So it probably, I think maybe it has, if it has some, if we're going to be able to isolate something, I'd say probably has something to do with the fact that they weren't interested in celebrating Purim. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that it doesn't mention God, but we just don't know. And I don't know, I don't know the literature on this, or if people have done much with that either. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Wow. This has been incredibly fascinating. I am
it's
so
been
honored
fun.
to have you on, and I'd love to have you back on whenever
Yeah,
you release your book.
you
You're
bet.
certainly welcome to come on and we'll talk about it.
And
Hey,
you'll be
tell
scandalized, and you'll have lots and lots of things to complain about. So
is that right? Well, I certainly am interested in taking a look at it. And go ahead and tell the audience where can they find out more about your material in addition to the book that we've mentioned. Is there a
yes,
website, channel, stuff like that?
my YouTube channel is probably the best place. That's where I publish most of my work is through videos. I try to do live streams on a regular basis. I try to get something out once a week. I will be going back to doing more edited, prepared content. The book has just kind of taken over my life for the last little
Mm,
while, so it's been difficult. But I also have a Patreon if you're interested in supporting my work. If you enjoy what I do, if you believe in what I do, I kind of pride myself on making a lot of really technical, high level, graduate level kind of biblical scholarship available and accessible for free. And if that's something you value, if that's something you're interested in, then I have a Patreon, and I would tremendously value your support over there. Those things are linked on my channel, but I make sure you get those
yes,
as
please.
well. I'm
Yeah.
on Twitter occasionally, and Blue Sky. And then yeah, I spend a lot of time just wandering around to other people's channels like this too.
Is that right?
So
Yeah,
yeah.
I saw you did an interview with the Danny Jones guy. That one was
Oh yeah.
fascinating. I really
Yeah.
enjoyed that, and I think you
Oh,
were
I'm
talking.
glad you enjoyed that one.
Yeah, the
So
Eamon Hillman guy and all that. I've seen some of that stuff. That's fascinating. Maybe I need to put a link to those in the show. So
yeah,
go check
yeah,
that
for
out.
sure.
Well, anyways, again, thank you so much for coming on. Everybody, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and go and check out Dr. Davis's channel and hit that subscribe button there too. See you later.
Thank you.